So today we're going to switch gears and we're going to study the qualifications for deacons. And I think one of the things we'll notice quickly is there are quite a few similarities between the qualifications, for the two offices. They're not identical in any means, but there are some things that'll be common themes between what Tony covered with you guys on qualifications for elders, and then what we'll find for deacons. So I've got a list real quick, just a quick recap on eldership requirements, and I'm just going to read through these. First and foremost, desires the work, right? I mentioned that the congregation I grew up at, several men there were probably qualified, with the exception of they did not want that role. Blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, patient, not a brawler, not covetous, rules his own house, have children under subjection, take care of the church, not a novice, and good rapport among outsiders. So let's dive right into 1 Timothy 3. We'll pick up at verse 8, and we'll read verses 8 and 9 to start, and then we'll go back and examine these two verses and dig a little deeper. So it says, likewise, deacons must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. And again, I mentioned in my opening comments, the same applies to deacons. Men must meet all of these requirements if they aspire to do this work. So if we look at the word deacon, it's translated from the Greek word diakonos, and the original word was meant to be a servant, or specifically a table waiter. I always wanted to be a waiter, like a legit waiter. Like, I've done a lot of things in 43 years. I've never worked as a waiter. I always thought I'd make a really good waiter. I'd probably mess up orders because I've got a really bad short-term memory. I wouldn't be the one that doesn't write your stuff down, but I always thought that'd be fun. Maybe it wouldn't be. Has anybody ever been a waiter? Have you been a waiter, Isaac?
Yeah, it was fun.
Was it fun? I know it'd be fun to talk to people. And Stephen, no, that's right. You were Steak and Shake. Yeah. I forgot about that. It wasn't fun. So you think about servant or table waiter. The one thing that this phrase does not carry, it's always carried the idea of a willing service, right? So, not bond servant or, a slavery type of, servant, but it's always a volunteer or willing, service. So the first thing is that a deacon must be reverent or grave. So if we look at this work of a deacon, it's one that God has called on to accomplish the work of the church. Therefore, one should not approach this with a lack of respect or seriousness. It's a role that we should take serious, and it should be a man that is able to maintain that level of respect or seriousness. A deacon must be serious-minded, and he must also be steady. The second thing that we read is that a deacon must not be double-tongued. Essentially, you can't say one thing with one group of people, and then when a different group of people say another thing. And the same could apply to conversations with individuals, right? I can't have a conversation with Kitty and, tell Kitty that, oh yeah, I see what you're saying. I support, I think you're on the right path. And as soon as I leave the room, I'm like, that Kitty is stupid. She doesn't know what she's talking about. I wouldn't do that to you, Kitty.
That's all right.
But
I could take it.
I know you can take it. But you can't tell people what they want to hear and then say something else behind their back. You need to be consistent in your messaging and your communication. I think we probably all can reflect back, and we know people in our life, maybe even today, that have that characteristic of being double-tongued. But that is a clear directive that a deacon must not be double-tongued. Yes.
Well, I feel like that is also something that we can struggle with too as well. Where,
Sure.
When we're talking with someone who we might not enjoy talking to, not really like, we put up a sort of front,
Yeah.
and then behind their backs we're like, man, like that person, like, oh, Steven, ugh, how annoying.
That's Stephen Taylor again. Jeez. Had to share a cabin with him for 7 nights. It's tough. Yes, Marcy.
But you change your mind, so if you were to do that, we go back to the person and talk to them about it.
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? If you have a change of heart or a change of mind, if you close the loop and circle back with that person and say, hey, after we talked, I've studied on this, or I've prayed on this, and maybe I was wrong before, right? And you make a good point, Edward, and I'll touch on this in a little bit. For both the elders and deacons, these list of qualifications, they're certainly not exclusive to elders and deacons, right? There's many characteristics that are described within both of these offices, if you will, that apply to every Christian. And we'll talk about that when we get into drinking, and the fact that Richie and I can have a little wine. It's not much. We'll talk about what does that mean, right? But you're spot on with your comment, though. That can be a struggle for all Christians. But that is a specific requirement that a deacon must not be double-tongued, nor should any Christian. And segueing perfectly into not given to much wine. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this one, because I think this is an interesting verse where a lot of people can take this verse and say, well, this gives us authority to do a little social drinking. And certainly if deacons can have a little wine, and they're supposedly held to a higher standard than and I use normal member, then Edward can have as much wine as he wants, right? I mean, if you think about it logically. So we'll talk about that. So not given to, and I'll have the word much underlined in my notes here. So let's look first at given to. The phrase given to here means to hold the mind towards, pay attention to, or apply oneself to. So if you hold your mind towards something, it's almost like you could almost substitute that word with addiction or obsession, or a focus on. And then there's a difference when you look at eldership requirements and then deacon requirements. So if I go to my list over here, so an elder can't, it says not given to wine, right? And then we read here that it says a deacon is not given to much wine. So we then have to answer the question, well, how much is much? What's much for me may not be much for Richie. What I would say is that both of these qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 for both elders and deacons warn us of the evils of drinking, right? They both specifically call out wine. But we get into a dangerous territory when we start to try to differentiate between moderate and not moderate levels of alcohol consumption. If I have 1 or 2 drinks or 3 drinks or whatever is moderate for me, at some point my judgment's going to get extremely skewed, right? I might have 2 drinks and say, you know what, a third or a fourth drink, that seems moderate to me. When in reality, I'm already intoxicated, right? So the drinker himself cannot determine what is much, because your judgment then becomes impaired. And if we look at it, this passage as an authorization for social drinking or casual drinking, and we look at it in the context of what we just talked about, where it says given to, which is, you know, really a focus, or you know, something that we hold the minds toward, or an addiction. You could really say that this would not only authorize drinking, but a moderate addiction to wine, which we know certainly is not the case if we look at the Bible holistically, right? So I want to look at a couple of scriptures real quick that are, you know, would be a direct contradiction to this if you were to use this as authorization to consume moderate amounts, you know, of wine, or to have a moderate addiction. The first one, let's flip over to Proverbs 20 and verse 1. Proverbs 20 and verse 1. And who would like to read that one for us?
Wine is a mocker. Strong drink is a brawler. And whosoever is led astray by it is not wise.
Absolutely. And if we go back to the qualifications for an elder, you know, it talks about they're not given to wine, and they're to also not be a brawler, right? And if you think about alcohol and being a brawler, sometimes those two things go hand in hand, right? I mean, how many stories have you heard of, you know, people getting some liquid courage and, you know, starting a fight at a bar or at a party or a wedding? Or I had some guys that work in my plant that got in a big fight at a wedding. Wasn't even their wedding. It's like, come on, man, what are you doing? And guess what? They were all drinking. Big surprise. Let's look next at 1 Peter 4:3. 1 Peter 4:3. It says, "For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry." And then the last one, let's go to Habakkuk 2:15 and 16. Have somebody read that one. Habakkuk 2:15 and 16.
Woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, that puttest thy bottle to him, and makest him drunken also, that thou mayest look on their nakedness. Thou art filled with shame for glory. Drink thou also, and let thy foreskin be uncovered. The cup of the Lord's right hand shall be turned unto thee, and shameful spewing shall be on thy glory.
Thank you, John. So if we look at the Bible holistically, right, and we look at this qualification for an elder and for a deacon in 1 Timothy 3, as I was reading through, you know, one of the commentaries, I really liked this viewpoint on drinking and its application towards these two roles. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there are very specific qualifications for both the office of an elder and a deacon. And I think that the reason for these specific qualifications is to put in place a separation, to really place men in leadership positions that have the highest qualities. It doesn't make them any better, right? You know, the elders are no better than, you know, the regular members, right? I'm no better than anybody in this room, but we are set apart and that we are held to a higher regard and a higher standard. And if John isn't given to wine, does that then allow other, and I'll use the word lesser in quotation marks, does that then allow lesser members that aren't held to such a high standard the authority to drink wine. If a deacon isn't given to much wine, does that make another, quote, normal member be able to be given to much wine? So if you think about it from that context, that these men are to be set apart and can drink in moderate amounts, would this not mean that other Christians consume alcohol in immoderate amounts? And I think what we just read in those 3 previous scriptures, tell us that we can't do that, right? I mean, we read multiple times throughout the Old and New Testament about drunkenness, and I always tell the young people when I talk to them that I've never known of any one single good thing to come from the consumption of alcohol, period. End of story. I've never met a single person that said, man, I am so glad that I started drinking. I am so glad I went and got drunk last night, Tony. I feel so good this morning. This headache's amazing. I've been puking all day. It's great. We make really poor decisions when we consume alcohol, right? And I would go back. So let's say that we all agreed that it's okay for me as a deacon to consume a moderate amount of alcohol. So today's Father's Day, right? Let's say I go out today with my family to Texas Roadhouse, which I'm not, because Texas Roadhouse is probably going to be a zoo. And I decide I want to consume a beer today at Texas Roadhouse. Somebody sitting 3 tables over from me says, Nick Pierce, I know him. He's a deacon at Alkire Road, and he's drinking beer. What does that then do for the reputation of Alkire Road, for the reputation of the church? If there is someone in a leadership role out in public drinking. We read in 1 Thessalonians 5:22 that we are to abstain from all appearances of evil. The same can be said if I consume it behind closed doors in my home, right? I got to get it from somewhere, right? Can you get liquor off Amazon? I don't know, I've not tried that. Tony, can you?
In moderation.
Moderation. Only 1 can at a time. You're going to have to go to the grocery store or the liquor store or somewhere and get it, right? And chances are, especially in somewhere like Grove City, you're going to see somebody you know or somebody that knows you, whether you talk to them or not. But we can certainly bring reproach on the church and shame on the church through our actions. So, I would state that in both of these applications for both elders and deacons, that we're certainly not authorized to consume alcohol through these scriptures, right? I know that Paul has told Timothy to consume a little wine for his stomach, for medicinal purposes, but it seems pretty counterintuitive to the rest of the scriptures to authorize drinking for someone in an office, a designated office of the church, if that wasn't applicable to all members within the body.
So as we've been discussing based on the scriptures we read, I would say apart from communion and medicinal.
You're a nurse. You're supposed to.
I know,
know
right?
this.
Medicinal purposes, that
Yeah.
alcohol consumption is unwise.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're saying is the scriptures here versus an elder, like the comparison of an elder not given to wine, deacon not given to much wine. Are you saying there's no difference then in what's being commanded?
I don't think there is. I don't think I can justify, and Rich, you tell me if you feel different as a deacon. I don't think 1 Timothy 3, justifies me to go and have a little wine and still be in a good covenant relationship with God. I think there's so many examples and so many references to it in a negative manner. I can't see a reason why you would want to introduce that into your lifestyle. Yes, Tony.
Then too, I think it's interesting when Edward brought up the medicinal purpose. When people are making that argument, it's not for medicinal purposes, number one. They're usually saying, I'm using that as an excuse to be able to drink my well for medicinal technology. What are you talking about?
I drink a bottle of wine to help me go to sleep every night.
And that medicinal purposes, it was because there was bad water.
Yeah.
And I believe the translation for that wine at that point is the non-alcoholic wine in the Bible, if I'm looking at that correctly. So then also you have, when you're looking at us as a whole, when you're in public, not only what you just said about the example, but who's to say that if one of the young members saw me drinking a glass of wine, and maybe I have one glass of wine and I'm fine, it doesn't affect any part of mine. But if that person sees me and says, oh, I can have a glass of wine, next thing you know, that person becomes an alcoholic, and now you're going to be responsible for the soul of that person. Our example is what defines really how we are to behave in public.
You nailed it.
In accordance with Scripture. So,
And everybody, that's a great point. And everybody always says, well, that's stupid, right? One drink of, every alcoholic had their first drink of something and set off that downward spiral, right? It has to start somewhere, and I certainly wouldn't want that on my conscience to be the reason that someone felt that it was acceptable to have that type of lifestyle.
And I would encourage anybody, I've done a huge study on alcohol in the Bible. I would encourage anybody to study the Greek and go through each verse that mentions wine and determine there's one that can mean both. But in context, we know that it's the juice from the grape. So I would encourage anybody to study the Greek, take each scripture that pertains to wine or juice, and you can determine, based on other verses in scripture, what you're talking about, that alcohol is not acceptable in a Christian lifestyle.
Agreed. Marcy?
Yeah, the influence is the biggest thing.
Yeah.
But you don't know who's gonna have the favorite to it. And like you said, first drink, everybody out there.
Yeah, I think, we could probably all say we know people in our lives that are alcoholics, right? Some alive, maybe some of them are not alive anymore. I literally had a neighbor when I was a kid that drank himself to death. He died in his recliner from overconsumption of alcohol, right? It's not up for debate that alcohol does anything good for your body, period, end of story. Any medicinal purpose that there may have been for alcohol back at the time of this writing, there's a modern day medicine that can now do the same thing that doesn't lead you down that road. Did you have your hand up a minute ago?
I was just gonna say, their wine back then was a lot different than what we have now too. I mean, the alcohol content in ours was like 5 times what they would have had in theirs. So if they were gonna be drinking to get drunk, it would take a lot more effort.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Yes.
As Christians in general, we have generally one opportunity to make a good first impression on people.
Yeah.
When people think about what a Christian is, what they think about is what they're not. Christians don't drink, smoke, or cuss. And if you do any of those, people are going to form an impression of you, and you're going to greatly reduce your impression upon them as a Christian.
And it might completely turn them off to ever entering the doors of a church, right? In some instances, we are the only example of the church and or a Christian that people see. And you're spot on. One thing that you do and they're like, gotcha. Don't want to be like that guy, right? Any other comments on that one?
I might make the point that, when you look at the qualifications for an elder versus qualifications for a deacon, an elder says not given to wine. So let's look at it today. Maybe we would maybe say elder is not to participate in any drinking, casual drinking, social drinking, whatever you want to categorize it. And some will say, okay, but a deacon, they can participate in an occasional drink or casual drinking or social drinking or however you want to say it. But realistically, when you look at this, just because if you would interpret that in that way, an elder is not to participate in social drinking, and a deacon can participate in social drinking. If you would look at it, that doesn't justify. If I was saying that an elder can't do social drinking, and if I said the deacon can't get drunk, that does in no way allow for a portion of that. In either case, whether it's an elder or a deacon, it doesn't grant us, well, an elder can't have any, but a deacon can have some. That's not what this passage is teaching. Just because in one instance for the elders, he says cannot have wine, and a deacon, they cannot have much wine, does not justify, okay, then you're granted some.
Right.
It's just another way, to me, the way I understand of saying the same thing. And today we could say, well, an elder can't drink and a deacon can't participate in social drinking or can't get drunk. Neither one of those allow for drinking. Just because I phrased it in a different way, that doesn't mean that just because I said a deacon can't get drunk, that doesn't mean I'm allowing them to social drink. And I think when we read of these qualifications, it's just another way of saying we're not to drink. We're not to have that. And as many have said, that example of others looking to us. So, I don't see these as necessarily contradicting one another. I just see these as a way of saying the same thing, is the way I look at it.
Nor as this one granting permission, to your point,
Right.
to drink some.
A little bit.
And I think if you step back and you look at it from that worldly perspective, and if you think of it from a hierarchy standpoint, and if you think elder, deacon, member, well, if an elder can't drink any, and a deacon can drink a little, if I'm a member, none of these apply to me. I can drink what I want.
Right.
And we know that's not the case, right? And I have it later in this chapter. We'll touch on it right now, because where John was talking kind of headed in that direction. I'll skip to verse 13. We'll come back, but it talks about, for those who have served well as a deacon obtain for themselves a good standing against the great boldness and the faith which is in Christ Jesus. So as I look through this room right now, we have two elders in here right now. We have a former elder in here, all three of which used to be deacons, right? I know that Jason used to be a deacon. I'm not sure about Jimmy. Did Jimmy ever serve as a deacon before being an elder? No. And I'm not saying that you have to serve as a deacon to be an elder, but it's a natural, progression and, kind of an evolution of roles, if you will, that, you could look at the role of a deacon, and really those are the men that we should be training and grooming if they have the desire to serve in that office to become future elders. So you certainly wouldn't want to enable a behavior as a deacon that you would then have to change, later on. Well, I got to give up drinking now because I don't want to be an elder, right? It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. So, okay, good comments. Any last comments on that before we move to verse 4? Or not verse 4, still in verse 8. All right, so the next thing to really wrap up this verse is they're not to be greedy of filthy lucre or greedy for dishonest gain. So what this means in its most simplistic nature is you can't be covetous, you can't be greedy, you can't be materialistic, and you cannot be involved in dishonorable or dishonest means of profit. I've personally seen greed in people's lives cause them to make some very poor decisions, do some very bad things. I want to talk for the rest of our, I guess, 2 minutes about filthy lucre, dirty money, money that's acquired through dishonest or questionable means. And I wanted to kind of pose a question to you guys and get some feedback. So let's say I left my job at Hill's Pet Nutrition, and I was recruited by the Budweiser factory in Columbus. It's a canning facility. I've got 5 years of experience in one of the largest canneries in the world, and they offer me a job there as their plant manager, making 5 times my normal current day salary. Be pretty good, chunk of change. And I went there with the intent of all of that extra money I made, I was going to give back to the church. I was going to give half of it to Fort Hill Christian Youth Camp. I was going to help, underprivileged kids and families. Would that be wrong? Tammy says yes.
According to scripture.
Only wrong if I'm a deacon, or what if I'm a normal member? What if I resign from, being a deacon and I'm just a normal member?
All pertains.
Would that be wrong? Would the elders pull me in and have a conversation with me about, where I work and the type of lifestyle that my products promote? And could that be considered, dirty money, right? Acquired through, questionable means? Yes, sir.
I would agree. I feel like in that case, when it comes to with alcohol, it's clearly yes, because there's not really any good to alcohol.
What if I worked for a cigarette company?
But what
The Bible doesn't talk about tobacco.
But what I was going to say is, what if we extend it over to, let's say, pharmaceuticals, for instance, right? Pharmaceuticals we know can be used for good, but we know, especially in Ohio, there's a drug crisis.
Huge problem. Yeah.
I feel like in cases like that, then I'd probably leave that up to the individual, because
Yeah, I think that's different if you have a product or business that has primarily a good influence on society, and some people choose to use it for bad. I don't think you're ever going to stop that. You can make that same argument for anything, for automobiles, right? For guns, for knives. But for something like alcohol that we know is specifically for one reason, I'm in full agreement that would absolutely be wrong. But I couldn't run a casino. I couldn't have a money laundering business, in my basement. Even if I gave it all to the church, right? It's wrong. Those type of characteristics for those types of men are not the people that we want in leadership positions, if you will, for the church at really any level. So we got through one verse. That was great. This pace will be done in 2035. So we'll pick up with verse 9 next week. We're going to finish chapter 3 next week.